The alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning and Marcus Reed was already awake. He had been awake for 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling of a bedroom so small that opening the closet door meant stepping onto the bed. The apartment was in Brooklyn, 3 flights up in a building that had been old when his grandparents were young, and it made sounds all night long. Pipes knocking, floors settling, the couple next door arguing in a language he didn't recognize but understood perfectly in tone. He got up before the alarm could wake Emma. That was the rule he had kept for 3 years without breaking it once. No matter how late the shift ran, no matter how much his back complained from pushing the industrial cleaning cart across 6 floors of hard tile, he was up first. Her breakfast would be ready before she shuffled out in socks that never matched. The kitchen was narrow enough that 2 people couldn't pass without turning sideways. Marcus moved through it with the efficiency of someone who had learned to work in tight spaces. Toast in the toaster, scrambled eggs in the pan, orange juice poured into the one glass that didn't have a chip on the rim. The edges of the toast came out darker than he intended, but Emma had stopped mentioning it a long time ago. She had learned, quietly and without anyone teaching her, that her father was doing the best he could. While the eggs cooked, Marcus opened the stack of mail on the counter. Rent due in 6 days. A second reminder from the school about the unpaid activity fee, the word second printed in red across the top like an accusation. Underneath those, a medical statement from 18 months ago. He had been chipping away at it $20 at a time, the balance dropping so slowly it felt like pushing a boulder uphill in the rain. Sarah had been sick for 2 years before she died. Ovarian cancer, stage 4 by the time they caught it, and the treatments had cost everything. Savings, retirement, a small account his father had left him that was supposed to be for Emma's college. Marcus had spent every dollar trying to keep his wife alive, and he did not regret a single one. But the aftermath of losing someone that way is not grief alone. It is debt that does not mourn with you. It is the particular loneliness of being the only parent left standing and the weight of knowing that every choice you make now has to be enough for 2 people. Emma came into the kitchen at 6:15, backpack already on her shoulders, shoes already tied. She was 8 years old and understood more about the world than any 8-year-old should have to. She ate her toast without complaint, even the dark edges. She drank her juice and rinsed the glass and set it in the dish rack without being asked. She had her mother's eyes, dark and serious, and sometimes when Marcus looked at her he felt like Sarah was still in the room, watching to make sure he didn't fall apart completely. A folded paper slipped from the front pocket of her backpack and fluttered to the floor. Marcus picked it up. Payment reminder, second notice, activity fee for the school art program. He set it on the counter without a word, kissed the top of her head, and told her to have a good day. She looked at him for a moment, her expression careful in the way children get when they are trying to protect their parents from worry. "It's okay, Dad. I don't need to do the art thing." "You're doing the art thing." "But I'll take care of it." She nodded and left, and Marcus stood in the kitchen listening to her footsteps fade down the stairwell. The building was quiet after that. He fixed a neighbor's circuit breaker, replaced an outlet in the unit below his, and checked the fuse box for an elderly woman 2 doors down who lost power every time she ran the microwave and the space heater at the same time. He worked fast and clean. His hands knew what they were doing. They always had. The work was small and the money was smaller. $20 here, 10 there, sometimes just a thank you and a plate of food he didn't have the heart to refuse. It wasn't enough to make a difference in the stack of bills on his counter, but it was what he could do, and so he did it. By the time he changed into his Sterling Tech uniform and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, the morning had already taken on the weight of a full day. Gray shirt, gray pants, his name stitched in white thread above the left pocket. There was something in his expression that had no clean name. Not shame, not defeat. Something quieter than both. The look of a man who had once stood at a very different kind of workstation and been very good at what he did, now preparing to spend the night invisible in a building full of people who would never think to ask. He locked the apartment and went to work. There were things about Marcus Reed that did not appear in his current employment file. They did not appear because he had never mentioned them, never listed them on the contract he signed when the cleaning service placed him at Sterling Tech, never spoken about them to any of the other night shift workers who occasionally nodded to him in the service elevator. He had put that version of himself away the way a person puts away a photograph of someone who is gone. Not destroyed, not forgotten, just somewhere he did not have to look at every day. 10 years earlier, Marcus had been a systems control engineer, not the kind who installed equipment and moved on. The kind who was called in when something complex had already failed, and the people who designed it could not figure out why. He had a talent difficult to explain to those who did not live inside technical systems, a spatial intuition about the way electrical signals moved through layered infrastructure, the way a conductor hears a wrong note before anyone else identifies the instrument. He had worked on smart building projects, industrial control platforms, integrated energy management systems for facilities handling hundreds of thousands of square feet. Morrison Blake Engineering had hired him straight out of grad school, and within 5 years he had a reputation. The kind that gets you called before anyone else picks up the phone. The kind that makes senior partners nervous because they know you could leave tomorrow and take 3 major clients with you. Then Sarah got sick. He had taken leave, then more leave. He missed the critical window on the Texas Energy Grid project, a massive infrastructure overhaul that required his sign-off on the core architecture. Not because he did not care, because he had been sitting in a hospital waiting room 3 states away, holding Emma on his lap, watching the clock on the wall and praying that the next nurse through the door would not have the look that meant bad news. By the time he returned, the project had failed. The grid integration had collapsed during the first stress test, and the client had filed a formal complaint. Morrison Blake needed someone to absorb the liability. The person with the most absence in the file was the easiest candidate. Marcus was not fired. He was managed out through reassignments and reduced responsibilities until there was no longer a role for him that matched what he had been. Too depleted to fight it, still grieving, he watched the gap in his resume widen until every door he knocked on opened only a crack before closing again. He had done what a man does when the world stops offering choices. He found work. He kept Emma fed. He moved into the smaller apartment. And nobody at Sterling Tech knew that the man pushing the floor cart through their corridors had spent years thinking in the same language their most expensive systems were written in. Victoria Sterling had not slept more than 5 hours in 3 days. She was 38 years old and ran Sterling Tech with a precision that her board alternately admired and resented depending on the quarter. She was not the kind of CEO who inspired loyalty through warmth or ease. She inspired it through clarity, the ability to see exactly what a situation required and move toward it without flinching. And right now, her board was asking questions she did not want to answer in the state the numbers were currently in. Sterling Tech had staked a significant portion of its future on a proprietary adaptive energy management platform designed to optimize power distribution in large commercial facilities in real time. The system adjusted load balance, cooling cycles, and backup protocols dynamically as conditions changed. It was sophisticated, expensive, and scheduled for its most important demonstration at 9 the following morning in front of institutional investors whose combined commitment would determine whether Sterling's next phase of development happened at all. If the demonstration succeeded, Sterling would close contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. Victoria would retain her authority, and 312 employees would keep their jobs. If it failed, the consequences would cascade in exactly the ways serious failures always do. Contracts pulled, board votes called, restructuring announced. She had seen it happen to other companies. She had no intention of letting it happen to hers. Derek Porter, her director of engineering, had assured her 3 times that week that everything was ready. He was good at assurances, good at the kind of confident technical language that fills a conference room with the impression of expertise. Dermot Hale, brought in 6 weeks earlier as an outside consultant with a billing rate that made her CFO wince, had reviewed the documentation and declared it sound. Victoria did one final walkthrough that evening. She passed through the 42nd floor around 9, noted the clean corridors and the quiet hum of the building's automated systems doing exactly what they were supposed to do. She passed a man pushing a cleaning cart near the server access hallway. She did not look at him. She was already composing the opening of tomorrow's presentation in her head, already thinking 3 moves ahead to the questions the investors would ask and the answers that would convince them to write the checks. She did not know that in 3 hours she would be asking that same man to stay in the room. The rain arrived just before midnight. It came in fast, the way storms do when they have been building over the ocean for hours and finally reach land with something to prove. A shift in pressure, a drop in temperature, and then the windows of the 42nd floor were running with water and thunder was close enough to feel in the floor. The cascade began at 12:17. It started with a fluctuation in the primary load distribution feed, small enough that the automated system flagged it at low priority and attempted self-correction. But the self-correction triggered a second process already running slightly outside its intended parameters. And that second process responded by locking a backup power sequence that should have remained on standby. Within 4 minutes, what had been a minor fluctuation had become a feedback loop. Server temperatures began to rise. The cooling response fired on the wrong cycle, responding to a temperature reading from 40 minutes earlier, not the current one. The building security protocols, sensing the irregular power behavior, began initiating partial lockdown sequences that further stressed the load distribution. By 12:25, every screen on the 42nd floor was red. Derek arrived first, still in his dress shirt with the tie loosened. He started issuing instructions immediately, the way a person does when they need to appear in control more urgently than they need to actually achieve it. The junior engineers moved fast, entering override commands, isolating subsystems, trying to reset the load balancers. Every intervention made something else worse. Dermot arrived 15 minutes later. He reviewed the boards for 30 seconds and announced that the problem was clearly in the backup hardware array. He recommended a full forced shutdown followed by a cold restart of the primary core. Derek pushed back. A cold restart would take 40 minutes minimum, and with the demonstration at 9, there was no margin for an unstable result. Dermot insisted it was hardware. Derek insisted it was a configuration issue. Neither of them was listening to the other, and nothing improved. Victoria arrived at 12:51. She stood in the doorway and the red light swept across her face, and she understood immediately that the situation was serious. She also understood, in the way that people who are very good at reading rooms understand things, that no one here was close to solving it. Marcus had been cleaning the corridor outside the operations center for the past 20 minutes. The hallway ran parallel to the room's glass wall, and in the reflected light of the screens inside, he could see the cascading error displays without trying to. He was not trying to watch. He was doing his job, moving the cart in long, even strokes, emptying trash bins, checking the corners where dust accumulated no matter how many times you cleaned them. But he had stopped moving. He was looking at the pattern on the screens, not the specific text, the pattern, the rhythm of alerts firing and responses launching and second-order alerts that followed. His mind did not need to consciously decide to analyze it. It simply did. An engineer came out and almost walked into him, told him to clear the hallway. Marcus moved the cart farther down the corridor and went back to looking at the glass. He already knew what was wrong, and he already knew that the people inside had no idea. The thing about complex system failures is that they almost never look like what they are. What they look like is the end result. What they actually are is something that happened much earlier, farther upstream, in a sequence of conditions that compounded slowly until they reached a threshold. The experts in the operations center were looking at the alarms. Marcus was looking at the sequence. He had figured it out within 3 minutes. The cooling system's erratic behavior was not the problem. The load distribution fluctuation was not the problem. They were symptoms. The actual problem was a conflict in the backup command chain, a priority lock set incorrectly during what he guessed was a routine firmware update several months earlier. The lock was preventing the load balancing protocol from releasing correctly when conditions changed suddenly. Under normal weather, the system could compensate. Under the simultaneous stress of a rapid pressure drop and the associated surge in HVAC demand, the conflict had finally broken through the surface. If they kept overriding symptoms, they would continue making things worse. If Dermot executed the cold restart, the system would come back up with the same conflict still embedded, and the whole cascade would start again within an hour, maybe less. Marcus stood in the corridor for a long time. He thought about Emma. The activity fee reminder with second in red. The medical bill, $20 at a time. He heard through the cracked door a junior engineer say that if the demonstration failed, the company was going to cut contractor services first. Night cleaning, building maintenance, first in, first out. Marcus looked at his mop. He looked at the boards inside. He looked at his hands. There are moments in a life when the choice is not between what is easy and what is hard. The choice is between what is safe and what is right. And sometimes the distance between those two things is so vast that crossing it feels like stepping off a cliff with no certainty that the ground will be there when you land. Marcus pulled off his work gloves. He set them on top of the cart. He took one slow breath, the kind you take when you are about to do something that cannot be undone, and he walked through the door. Nobody heard him come in at first. He moved near the main display wall, close enough to see the log streams, far enough not to be in anyone's path. He stood there for a moment reading. Then he spoke. "The fault isn't in the voltage regulators. You're fixing the wrong thing." The room went quiet in stages. Derek turned around. His expression moved through surprise, confusion, and then settled into something sharper. "Who let this man in? This is a restricted operations area." Dermot made a sound, not quite a laugh, somewhere between dismissal and contempt. "If things have gotten to the point where the janitorial staff is offering technical opinions, then we really are in trouble." A few junior engineers exchanged glances. One of them, a young woman named Sophie Chen, looked at Marcus's uniform and then at the floor. Marcus did not respond to any of it. He stepped forward and pointed to a specific column of data on the nearest screen. "That's not hardware degradation. Look at the log interval on the secondary failover. It's not firing because of a hardware fault. It's locked. The priority assignment in the backup command chain is in conflict with the load transfer protocol. The system is fighting itself." Another silence. Different this time. Derek's voice shifted, taking on the quality of someone working hard to sound certain when certainty has just started to slip. "That's impossible. The configuration has been reviewed and certified," Marcus asked without raising his voice. "When was the last major firmware update on the environmental response module?" Nobody answered immediately. Sophie Chen quietly pulled up a maintenance log on a secondary screen and said something low to the person beside her. Derek straightened, his jaw tight. "I want this man removed." Victoria had been standing near the back of the room. She had not spoken since she arrived. She had been watching, first the boards, then the engineers, then the exchange unfolding in front of her. She had been in enough rooms with enough people under pressure to know the difference between someone performing competence and someone who actually possesses it. Marcus was not performing anything. He was trying to stop them from making a fatal mistake, and the effort of not raising his voice to do it was the most revealing thing in the room. "Let him finish." Derek turned to look at her. She said it again, quieter. "Let him finish." Then she looked at Marcus directly for the first time. Not at the uniform, at him. "What do you need?" 5 minutes and access to the configuration management terminal. If I'm wrong, I'll leave on my own." Derek started to object. Victoria said his name, just his name, and he stopped. She nodded at the terminal. Marcus sat down. When someone who is unsure of themselves sits at an unfamiliar display, they scan too much. They glance around, checking labels, hunting for the right menu. Marcus did none of that. He pulled up the system log with 3 keystrokes, located the configuration event history in under a minute, and began reading with the focused stillness of a person who was alone in a room they had been in 100 times before. Sophie Chen watched him work, her eyes widening slightly. She leaned toward the engineer next to her. "That diagnostic pattern, I've only seen it in legacy Morrison Blake documentation." Marcus identified 3 core problems as he worked. The first, a backup load transfer command chain set to override priority during a firmware update 7 months earlier, locking it in conflict with the primary distribution protocol under high variance conditions. The second, a legacy load balancing subroutine from a previous system version that had not been fully deprecated during migration, still running in a background process, issuing corrections that directly contradicted what the active system was trying to do. 2 sets of instructions, both internally legitimate, both catastrophically wrong in combination. The third, an extreme weather response protocol configured to weight inputs too heavily toward historical baseline data rather than live sensor readings. When the storm arrived and conditions shifted faster than the baseline predicted, the protocol began responding to conditions that no longer existed. Derek said that none of this had appeared in the external assessment, Marcus said without looking up. The assessment was done under standard load conditions. This failure only presents under simultaneous multivariable stress. You wouldn't have seen it on a normal day. Dermot said he wanted independent verification before anyone touched the settings. Marcus said, "If you'd done the restart you suggested 40 minutes ago, the conflict would still be embedded. The system would have come back up, run for about 90 minutes, and gone down again, probably during your 9 o'clock presentation." The room was very quiet after that sentence. Dermot did not argue. Marcus asked Sophie to run a cross-validation on the priority assignment tables. She looked at Victoria first. Victoria nodded once. Sophie ran it. The output confirmed everything Marcus had described. He worked through the correction in a deliberate sequence, isolating the legacy subroutine first, then adjusting the priority lock in the backup command chain, then reconfiguring the environmental response protocol to favor live sensor inputs over historical data. He explained each step before executing it, not because anyone asked, but because he was the kind of engineer who narrated his work when the stakes were high. It reduced the chance of someone misunderstanding and undoing a step they did not recognize. When the 3 corrections were staged, he paused. He checked the server temperature trend one final time. Then he looked at Victoria. "When I reinitialize the balancing sequence, there will be about 8 seconds where everything goes dark. If I've done this right, it comes back stable." She asked, "And if you haven't?" "Then we're in the same place we were 20 minutes ago, except we know exactly what the problem is, and we have a cleaner path to try again." She held his gaze for a moment, then she said, "Do it." He executed the sequence. Every screen in the operations center went black. The warning sounds cut off completely. For 8 seconds the room was silent in a way that felt physical. The absence of alarm after sustained crisis is not quiet. It is something closer to held breath. The pause before a verdict. Then the screens came back, one by one. Main display, secondary arrays, environmental monitors, server temperature dashboards. The load distribution began evening out, slowly but visibly, like water finding its level. The server temperatures, which had been climbing for 40 minutes, plateaued and then, 1 degree at a time, began to fall. The warning indicators cycling across every panel moved from red through orange through yellow, then green. All of them. Every single one. A junior engineer in the back said something very quietly. He fixed it. Nobody celebrated. The silence was different now. Not tension, but something people were not quite sure how to process. Derek stood very still near the far wall, looking at the boards. Dermot had not moved. Sophie stared at her screen with wide eyes, watching the stabilization data roll in line by line. Marcus stood up from the terminal. He looked at the boards long enough to confirm what he needed to confirm, and then he stepped back. Victoria was looking at him. "The system will hold. I would recommend having someone verify the configuration before the demonstration, just to confirm nothing else was affected during the instability period." Then he walked to the door, picked up his work gloves from the top of the cleaning cart in the hallway, and went back to work. Victoria did not sleep. She sat in her office for an hour after the operations center cleared, and the silence felt louder than the crisis had been. The city stretched out below her window, lights scattered across the grid like stars fallen to earth, and she thought not about the technical details of what had just happened. She had followed those well enough in real time. She thought about the man. At 1 in the morning, she picked up her phone and called Sophie Chen. "Pull the personnel record for Marcus Reed. Full file. Everything we have." Sophie's voice came back cautious, aware that questions at this hour meant something significant had shifted. "The janitor?" "The engineer." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the sound of keys clicking. "I'll send it to you in 10 minutes. Victoria hung up and called George Nolan, the night security supervisor who had been with Sterling Tech since before it was Sterling Tech, back when it was a 3-person startup operating out of a converted warehouse in Queens. "George, I need you to help me access the older HR database, the one that predates our last infrastructure migration." "Looking for something specific?" "Looking for someone." The file that came back over the next 2 hours was not what Victoria had expected, though in retrospect she realized she should have seen it coming. The personnel record Sterling Tech had on file showed Marcus Reed hired 18 months ago through a third-party cleaning contractor. High school diploma listed, no college. Previous employment vague, listed only as maintenance and facilities work. Reference checks minimal, the kind of surface-level verification that happens when you are hiring someone to empty trash bins and mop floors, not to make critical decisions. But the older database, the one George pulled from archived servers that had not been touched in 5 years, told a different story. Marcus Reed had been a systems control engineer of significant standing. His early career showed involvement with 3 major smart building development firms: Morrison Blake Engineering, Castellan Systems, Bridger Industrial. Listed as senior technical lead on projects valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars. His peer evaluations used language not common in standard HR assessments. Phrases like exceptional diagnostic instinct and located the fault in 4 hours that the external team had missed in 2 weeks. There was a gap in the record, 2 years where the employment history went dark. Then a scattering of short-term contract work, each position a step down from the last. Facilities technician, building maintenance, equipment repair. The trajectory of a man whose professional standing had been quietly dismantled, impossible to recover from when you are simultaneously dealing with a family catastrophe and have no energy left for professional warfare. Victoria found the incident report buried in a folder of legal documents Morrison Blake had submitted during a contract dispute years earlier. The Texas Energy Grid Project, a massive infrastructure overhaul that had collapsed during stress testing, resulting in a formal complaint from the client and a settlement that cost Morrison Blake nearly $8 million. The internal investigation had pointed to a critical oversight in the core architecture review process, and the engineer responsible for that review had been Marcus Reed. Except Marcus Reed had not been present during the review window. He had been on extended family medical leave. The documentation showed the leave approved, the reason listed as spouse critical illness. The project had proceeded without him, using his preliminary designs, but lacking his final sign-off on integration points that required his specific expertise. When the failure happened, the blame had been distributed in the way large firms distribute blame when they need someone to absorb liability and cannot afford to lose the senior partners who made the actual decisions. Marcus had been the easiest target, the most absence in the file, the least political capital to defend himself. Victoria sat back in her chair and stared at the screen. She thought about the moment she had walked past him in the corridor earlier that evening, composing her presentation in her head, not registering him as anything other than a piece of the building's background functionality. She thought about how close she had come to telling Derek to remove him from the room. She thought about what the 9 o'clock presentation would have looked like if she had. The sky outside her window was beginning to lighten, the black fading to deep blue at the edges. She picked up her phone and sent one message to her assistant. "Add Marcus Reed to the program for tomorrow morning. I will explain when you arrive." Then she went down to the building's gym on the 3rd floor, changed into workout clothes she kept in a locker, and ran on the treadmill until her legs burned and her mind stopped circling the same thoughts over and over. By the time she showered and dressed and returned to her office, the sun was fully up and the building was beginning to fill with the early arrivals who came in before 7 to prove their dedication. Derek was one of them. He appeared in her doorway at 7:15, his expression carefully neutral. "We need to talk about last night." "Yes, we do. I don't think it's appropriate to bring a contractor into a restricted operational situation without proper vetting." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "He solved a problem in 15 minutes that you and a $600 an hour consultant couldn't identify in 40. I think the vetting question is irrelevant at this point." Derek's jaw tightened. "We don't know anything about this man. Where he came from, what his credentials are. I know exactly where he came from. I know exactly what his credentials are. And I know that if I had listened to you last night, we would be calling investors this morning to cancel the demonstration instead of preparing to run it." She stood up and walked to the window, her back to him. "The demonstration proceeds as scheduled. Marcus Reed will be present. And if you have a problem with that, you are welcome to discuss it with the board after we close the contracts." Derek left without another word. Victoria stood at the window and watched the traffic building on the street below, the city waking up to a day that had no idea how close it had come to disaster. The investor presentation was scheduled for 9 in the main atrium, a high-ceiling space with glass walls and polished stone floors that Sterling used for events significant enough to require impression. 41 people in the room, 12 institutional investors and their staff, 4 board members, 2 financial advisors, and the remainder senior Sterling leadership. Derek had arrived early and positioned himself near the front, his face giving nothing away. Dermot sat in the second row. He had not spoken to anyone since arriving, and the careful blankness of his expression suggested he was doing calculations about how the events of the previous night would affect his professional reputation if they became widely known. Marcus had been about to leave the building when Sophie found him near the service entrance at 8:40, still in his work uniform, carrying his bag. The shift had ended at 6, but he had stayed late to finish the floors on the west wing that he had abandoned during the crisis. His supervisor had already clocked him out, told him not to worry about the overtime, that somebody upstairs had called down and said to make sure Marcus Reed was taken care of. Sophie's voice was tentative, like she was approaching someone who might startle. "Mr. Reed?" He turned. Up close, she could see the fatigue in his face, the kind that comes from 9 hours into a shift that should have ended 3 hours ago. "The CEO requested your presence for the morning session, specifically requested. Would you be willing to stay?" Marcus thought about saying no. He was exhausted. He was still wearing the same gray uniform he had worn all night. His back ached and his feet hurt, and all he wanted was to go home and sleep for 6 hours before Emma got out of school. But something in Sophie's expression, a kind of careful respect that he had not seen directed at him in a very long time, made him stay. "Yeah, I can stay." She walked him to a side entrance to the atrium and pointed to a row of chairs along the wall where building services staff had been asked to sit if they wanted to observe company events. Marcus sat. The chairs were uncomfortable and positioned so that anyone sitting in them would be visible but not central, present but not participating. He had sat in chairs like this before, at school events and parent meetings, the chairs they gave to people who were welcome to attend but not expected to contribute. Victoria took the stage at 9 exactly. She moved through the opening with the precision of someone who had given this presentation 100 times in her head before she ever stood in front of an audience. Market position, technology roadmap, projected performance metrics. She was precise and composed, and the room listened with the careful attention that institutional investors bring to presentations involving their money. Then she stopped. She set down the remote. She looked out at the room, and when she spoke again, her tone had changed. Not more casual, more direct, more honest than a prepared presentation is ever designed to be. "Before we continue, I need to tell you something." The room shifted, attention sharpening. "The system you are here to evaluate experienced a critical failure last night, a failure serious enough that without intervention, this demonstration would not have been possible." Several investors leaned forward, One of them began typing on a tablet. Victoria continued without pause. The failure was identified and corrected. The system is fully stable and the demonstration will proceed. But I am not going to continue without acknowledging the person responsible for that outcome, because that person is in this room, and what happened last night is something you need to understand. She paused, letting the weight of what she was about to say settle. At 12:51 this morning, our most experienced engineers could not identify the root cause of a cascading system failure. An outside consultant with an industry-wide reputation could not identify it. After 40 minutes, we were still losing ground. Another pause. The person who found the fault, isolated it, and corrected it was present in this building at that hour, not as an engineer, not as a consultant, but as a member of our overnight cleaning staff, a man named Marcus Reed. The room turned, head swiveling, eyes searching. Marcus sat very still in his gray uniform, his hands resting on his knees. He had not moved when his name was called. He had learned a long time ago that the best way to handle attention you did not want was to become as still and unremarkable as possible until it passed. But Victoria was not letting it pass. She looked directly at him and continued. She described what had happened. The failure cascading across multiple subsystems, the expert response that could not locate the source. The moment Marcus had stepped through the door and identified the problem with a precision that had silenced the room. The 15 minutes that followed, watching him work through a 3-layer architectural fault with the kind of fluency that comes only from someone who has spent years living inside systems like the one that was failing. Then she said something that made the entire room go still. Talent does not always arrive in the form we expect. Last night it arrived in a gray work uniform carrying a mop. And the only reason this company is standing here this morning is because one person in that building was willing to look past what someone was wearing and listen to what they were actually saying. She looked at the full room, her gaze moving across the investors, the board members, the senior staff. That is the kind of judgment I intend to apply going forward, in our hiring, in our operations, and in the way we treat every person who works in this building. She picked up the remote again. Her voice was steady, final. "Mr. Reed, thank you." Marcus nodded once, slowly. He did not stand. He did not make a speech. In that moment, his name had been spoken in a room full of people whose decisions moved millions of dollars, and it had been spoken not because of a failure, not because of an absence that needed explaining, but because of what he knew and what he had been willing to do with it, even when doing it felt impossible. An older man in the third row stood up. He was in his 60s, well-dressed, the kind of presence that suggested he had been in rooms like this for decades and knew exactly when protocol could be bent. "Ms. Sterling, if I may." Victoria nodded. The man turned to look at Marcus. "Mr. Reed, I'm David Morrison, Morrison Blake Engineering." Marcus felt something cold move through his chest. He knew that name. He had worked for Morrison Blake. He had been destroyed by Morrison Blake. Morrison continued, his voice carrying clearly across the atrium. "I worked with you on the Texas Energy Grid project in 2014. You weren't responsible for that failure. Everyone who was actually involved knew it. I'm sorry we didn't fight harder for you then." The silence that followed was different from the one before. This was not attention settling on someone unexpected. This was recognition, public and witnessed, from someone whose word carried weight in the industry. Marcus met Morrison's eyes and nodded once. There were no words that fit the moment, so he did not try to find any. Victoria resumed the presentation. She moved through the demonstration, showing the system's adaptive response protocols, the real-time load balancing that had been stabilized by Marcus's corrections hours earlier. The investors asked sharp questions, and she answered them without hesitation. By the time the session ended at 10:30, 3 of the institutional groups had indicated preliminary commitment and 2 more had requested follow-up technical briefings. Derek sat very still in the front row, his expression unreadable. Dermot had left halfway through, his departure quiet and unremarked. After the presentation, Victoria met with Marcus in a small conference room on the 38th floor. The city was visible through the window, morning sun burning off the last of the storm clouds over the rooftops. She did not speak to him the way people speak to someone they are doing a favor for. She spoke with the direct language of someone who knows precisely what they need and has identified the person who can provide it. "I found your employment history, all of it." Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say that would change what she had already learned. "The circumstances under which your career ended were, in my assessment, unjust. I'm not in a position to undo any of that, but I am in a position to offer you something that might be the beginning of a different trajectory." She outlined the role. Systems Reliability Advisory position, working within the engineering division to identify and address complex operational vulnerabilities before they became crises. Real work with a team reporting to him on diagnostic assignments. A salary more than 3 times his cleaning contract. Full benefits. A schedule structured, she said carefully, to accommodate a parent with school-age responsibilities. Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured. "I want to be honest with you. I've been out of the professional side of this field for a long time. My software currency will need updating. I don't want to walk into a role and find out 6 months later that I was hired for the story rather than the substance." Victoria looked at him and something in her expression shifted, a flicker of what might have been respect or recognition or both. "The man who sat down at my configuration terminal last night and identified a 3-layer architectural fault in under 10 minutes does not need to worry about his currency. Last night you didn't need anyone to help you. Don't start needing it now." Something shifted in Marcus's expression too, not dramatically, but the way light changes on a surface when a cloud moves. He thought about Emma. The bills on the counter. The apartment that was too small and too tired and had been home for 3 years because it was what he could afford. He thought about the look on his daughter's face when she pretended the activity fee didn't matter, when she tied her own shoes and packed her own lunch and tried so hard not to be one more thing he had to carry. "I'll take the position. I have one request. I'd like to start on the actual work immediately. No transition period, no observation phase. I work better when I have a real problem to solve." "That's exactly why I offered you the job." They shook hands. Through the window behind her, the last clouds from the previous night's storm were moving east, and the sky in their wake was clear all the way to the horizon. Marcus took the long way home. He walked 3 extra blocks after getting off the train, through the neighborhood that had not changed since he moved there. The same corner store with the same faded awning, the same fenced playground where the swings never seemed to get fixed, the same row of brick buildings with their fire escapes and their mixture of noise and quiet that meant people were living their lives behind those walls, struggling and succeeding and failing and trying again. He had walked this route 1,000 times in the dark after night shifts, his body aching and his mind already thinking about the next day's bills and whether Emma needed new shoes and how long he could stretch the groceries. He walked it now in the bright morning light, and the neighborhood looked the same. Or maybe he was the one who was different, and the neighborhood had simply been here all along, waiting for him to see it with new eyes. The apartment was quiet when he unlocked the door. Emma was still at school. The refrigerator still hummed. The kitchen table was still shimmied by the folded takeout menu. The paint still peeled near the baseboards. He made coffee and sat at the table and looked at the room. He had spent a long time looking at this room as evidence of failure, of how far he had fallen, how much distance existed between what he was and what he had been. He looked at it now and saw something else. The place where he had kept going when keeping going was the hardest thing he had ever done, where he had packed Emma's lunches and paid what bills he could and put on the uniform and gone out into the dark. Not because it was the life he had planned, but because it was the life he had, and there was a child in it who needed him to keep showing up. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. "First assignment, full infrastructure audit starting Monday. Your office will be ready. Bring your daughter by sometime this week. I'd like to meet her." Marcus read the message twice. The last sentence was not professional courtesy. It was something else. a crossing of the boundary between employer and employee into territory that suggested Victoria saw him not just as a solution to a technical problem, but as a person with a life outside the building, as someone worth knowing. He was still sitting there when the front door opened and small feet came down the hall. Emma dropped her backpack by the door the way she always did and came into the kitchen and stopped because he was home in the middle of the day, and that did not happen. "Dad, are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm better than okay. You might want to sit down." She sat across from him, knees folded under her, watching his face with those careful eyes that had always seen more than he gave her credit for. He told her what had happened. The broken system, the room full of experts who could not fix it, the moment he had walked through the door. The woman who had stood up in front of a room full of important people and said his name out loud. The job offer, the salary, the office, the schedule that would let him be home when she got out of school. Emma listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was thinking something through carefully. "So, they finally figured out you're actually good." Marcus felt something close in his throat. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Emma pushed herself up from her chair and walked around the table and wrapped both arms around his neck. He put his arms around her and held on. "I already knew," she said into his shoulder. He held her tighter. Outside, the afternoon sun came in through the window at a low angle, filling the old kitchen with more light than it usually held at this hour. The refrigerator hummed. A train passed 2 blocks over, rattling the glass the way it always did. Everything in the room was the same as it had been that morning, and nothing was. Emma pulled back and looked at him, her face serious. "Can I tell my teacher about your new job?" "Yeah. You can tell your teacher. And my friends? You can tell anyone you want." She smiled, and it was the first real smile he had seen on her face in longer than he could remember. Not the careful smile she used when she was trying to make him feel better. A real one, unguarded and bright. "I wrote something for school, for homework. Can I show you?" She ran to get her backpack and came back with a folded piece of paper. Marcus unfolded it and read, "My hero is my dad. He used to be an engineer, but he had to take care of my mom when she was sick. Now he cleans buildings at night so I can go to school. Some kids at school say their dads have important jobs. But my dad fixes things that are broken. He fixes things in our building for free. He makes my breakfast every morning even when he's tired. I think that's more important than any job. I'm proud of him." Marcus read it twice and then a third time because his vision was blurring and he needed to make sure he had read every word correctly. When he looked up, Emma was watching him with an expression that was trying very hard to be brave and not quite succeeding. "I was going to turn it in tomorrow, but now I can add the ending." Her voice was small, careful. "The ending where everyone else finally sees what I always saw." Marcus set the paper down on the table and pulled her into another hug, and this time he did not try to stop the tears. They came quietly, the way grief comes when it has been held back for so long that its release feels like something breaking and healing at the same time. They sat like that for a while, father and daughter in a kitchen that had held them through the longest and hardest years, and the light through the window turned the old cracked linoleum into something that looked almost golden. When Marcus's phone rang again, Emma pulled back and looked at him. "You should answer that, Dad. They need you." He looked at the screen. Victoria Sterling. He answered, "Marcus, I need you to review our entire infrastructure, starting with the system you helped design 10 years ago." He felt something shift in his chest, a combination of surprise and recognition, the way you feel when someone tells you something you should have known all along. "What do you mean, helped design?" Sterling Tech's core platform is built on architecture Morrison Blake developed for the Castellan project in 2012. You were the lead systems engineer on that project. We bought the licensing rights 8 years ago. I didn't know until this morning when I went through the documentation. Marcus closed his eyes. The Castellan project, one of the last major assignments he had completed before Sarah got sick. He had spent 18 months on that architecture, designing an integrated control framework that could scale across multiple facility types. He had been proud of that work. It had been elegant, efficient, one of the best things he had ever built. I didn't know anyone was still using it. We're using it, and I need the person who designed it to tell me what else we're missing. I need you to look at it with fresh eyes and tell me where the next failure is going to come from before it happens. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at Emma, who was watching him with an expression of fierce pride. When do you want me to start? Monday, 9 a.m. Your office will be ready. I'll be there. He hung up and looked at his daughter. Looks like I'm going back to work. Emma grinned. Looks like they're lucky to have you. Outside the window, the afternoon sun continued its slow arc across the sky, and the city went on being a city, full of people living their lives and not knowing that in a small kitchen in Brooklyn, something that had been broken for a very long time was finally beginning to heal. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of October day where the air felt sharp enough to cut. Marcus stood outside Sterling Tech at 8:45 wearing a suit he had bought on Saturday from a department store in Manhattan, the first suit he had purchased in 4 years. The fabric was stiff and the shoulders sat a little too square, but it fit well enough, and Emma had told him he looked like the dad she remembered from before, when he used to leave for work in the morning carrying a leather briefcase instead of a mop. The lobby felt different when you walked through it as an employee instead of service staff. The security guard, who had nodded at him for 18 months without really seeing him, now checked his new ID badge and welcomed him to the team. The elevator that he had always taken to the service floors now carried him to the 37th floor, where the engineering division occupied an entire wing of open-plan workstations and glass-walled conference rooms. Sophie Chen was waiting for him when the elevator doors opened. She had been assigned as his liaison for the first week, someone to help him navigate the systems and introduce him to the team he would be working with. She smiled when she saw him, a genuine expression that suggested she was actually happy he was there. Your office is this way. She led him down a corridor past workstations where engineers were already deep into their morning routines, headphones on, screens filled with code and diagnostic panels. The office was smaller than he had expected, but positioned with a window that looked out over the city, and inside was a desk with 3 monitors already set up, a chair that looked like it cost more than his monthly rent used to be, and a whiteboard that covered an entire wall. Victoria wanted to make sure you had everything you needed. If there's anything missing, just let me know. Marcus set his bag down and looked around the space. It had been a long time since he had an office. The last one had been at Morrison Blake, a corner space with a view of the Hudson River and a door he could close when he needed to think. This office was smaller, but it was his, and that meant something. This is good. Thank you. Sophie handed him a tablet with the infrastructure documentation already loaded. Victoria wants you to start with the core platform architecture. Full audit, top to bottom. She said you'd know what to look for. Marcus took the tablet and pulled up the first set of schematics. The moment he saw them, recognition hit like a physical thing. This was his work. The control framework he had designed for Castellan Systems in 2012, the integrated architecture that had taken him 18 months to build and another 6 months to test. Someone had modified it, added layers and modules he had never designed, but the core structure was still there, his fingerprints all over it. I'm going to need access to the full system history, every modification, every update, every firmware patch for the last 8 years. Sophie nodded. Already queued up. Victoria figured you'd ask for that first. She left him to work, and Marcus sat down at the desk and began reading. Within an hour, he had identified 3 potential vulnerability points, places where the modifications had been layered onto his original design without fully accounting for how the systems would interact under stress. None of them were critical yet, but they were the kind of issues that compounded over time, waiting for the right conditions to cascade into failure. He was deep into the environmental control protocols when Derek appeared in his doorway. The engineering director stood there for a moment without speaking, his expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested significant effort was being expended to keep it that way. "I wanted to welcome you to the team." Marcus looked up from the tablet. "Thank you." Derek stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. "I also wanted to clear the air about what happened last week. I may have been hasty in my initial response to your intervention. The situation was chaotic, and I was focused on maintaining operational protocol. It was an apology that was not quite an apology, the kind of statement designed to acknowledge fault without actually accepting responsibility." Marcus had heard 100 versions of it over the years from people who needed to be seen as gracious without actually feeling any grace. "The system is stable. That's what matters." Derek nodded slowly. "Victoria has asked me to provide you with full access to the engineering team and all ongoing projects. If there's anything you need, my door is open." He left without waiting for a response. Marcus watched him go and understood that what had just happened was not an apology or a welcome. It was Derek establishing the terms of engagement, making it clear that while Marcus might have Victoria's support, he would still need to navigate the political landscape of the engineering division carefully. Sophie appeared again at lunch with an offer to show him the cafeteria and introduce him to some of the other senior engineers. The cafeteria was on the 25th floor, a bright open space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a salad bar that looked like it belonged in a restaurant. Marcus got a sandwich and coffee and followed Sophie to a table where 3 engineers were already sitting. The introductions were cordial but careful. These were people who had heard about what happened during the crisis, who knew that Marcus had been brought in over Derek's objections, and who were trying to figure out where he fit in the hierarchy. One of them, a systems architect named Robert Chen, asked the question everyone was clearly thinking. "So, what's your background? Where were you working before Sterling?" Marcus could have deflected, could have given a vague answer that acknowledged his past without specifying details. But something about the way Robert asked the question, with genuine curiosity rather than challenge, made him decide to be honest. "I was working here. Night shift, cleaning crew. Before that, I was out of the field for a few years. Before that, I was at Morrison Blake Engineering." The table went quiet. Morrison Blake was a name everyone in this room would recognize, one of the top firms in the industry. Robert's expression shifted from polite interest to something closer to respect. "You worked on the Castellan project?" "I led it." Sophie spoke up, her voice careful. "The platform we're running now is built on that architecture." "I know. I started reviewing it this morning." Robert leaned forward. "What do you think?" Marcus considered how to answer. He could be diplomatic, could soften his assessment to avoid stepping on toes. But these were engineers, and engineers respected honesty more than they respected politeness. "I think whoever has been modifying it for the last 8 years understood the surface layer but missed some of the deeper integration points. The additions are competent, but they're creating stress points that aren't visible under normal load." Another engineer at the table, a woman named Jennifer Park, nodded slowly. "We've had intermittent issues with the secondary failover protocols for the last 6 months. Nothing critical, just odd behavior during high-demand periods." That's one of the stress points. The failover logic is trying to interact with a load-balancing module that wasn't designed to handle the kind of dynamic scaling you've added. It works most of the time, but when conditions shift too fast, it gets confused. Robert and Jennifer exchanged a look. Jennifer pulled out her phone and started typing notes. "Can you fix it?" "That's what I'm here for." The conversation shifted after that, becoming more technical, less careful. By the time lunch ended, Marcus had 3 engineers offering to pull diagnostic logs and 2 more asking when he could review their subsystems. He left the cafeteria with the sense that while Derek might be managing the political optics, the engineers themselves were willing to accept him based on what he could actually do. The afternoon passed in a blur of documentation and analysis. Marcus identified 2 more vulnerability points and drafted preliminary recommendations for addressing them. At 4 o'clock, Victoria stopped by his office, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed. "How's the first day?" "Productive. I've found 5 issues so far. None of them critical, but all of them worth addressing." Derek came to see you. It was not a question. Victoria had eyes and ears throughout the building, and nothing that happened on the engineering floor escaped her attention. He welcomed me to the team. And I think he's trying to figure out how to manage the fact that you hired someone who makes him look bad. Victoria smiled, a brief flash that suggested she had expected exactly this answer. Derek is very good at managing up and adequate at managing down. What he's not good at is recognizing when he's wrong. I need you to focus on the work and let me handle Derek. She pushed off from the doorframe. Bring Emma by this week. I meant what I said about wanting to meet her. Marcus watched her leave and thought about the difference between people who led through authority and people who led through power. Victoria had both, but she wielded them differently, using authority to establish direction and power only when someone forced her hand. It was the kind of leadership he had seen rarely in his career and respected deeply when he found it. He worked until 6, then packed up the tablet and took the train back to Brooklyn. Emma was waiting at the apartment with a neighbor who had agreed to watch her for the first week until Marcus's schedule settled. She bounced up when he came through the door, her face bright with questions. "How was it? What's your office like? Did you fix anything?" He told her about the office, the window, the whiteboard that covered an entire wall. He told her about the engineers he had met, the problems he had identified, the way people had listened when he explained what needed to change. She listened with the fierce attention of someone who had waited a long time to hear her father talk about work as something other than survival. "The CEO wants to meet you. She said you should come by this week." Emma's eyes went wide. "Really? The actual CEO?" "The actual CEO. She said to bring you by whenever you want." Emma was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Can I wear my good dress? The blue one?" "You can wear whatever makes you feel good." She grinned and ran to her room to check if the dress still fit. Marcus stood in the kitchen and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not quite happiness, not yet, but something close, the sense that the future might contain more than just getting through the day. Wednesday afternoon, Marcus brought Emma to Sterling Tech. She wore the blue dress and her nicest shoes and had insisted on brushing her hair 3 times to make sure it was perfect. In the elevator up to the executive floor, she stood very still, her hand in his, her eyes fixed on the numbers climbing. Victoria's assistant met them in the reception area and led them to a conference room where Victoria was waiting. She stood when they entered, and Marcus watched Emma's posture shift, her back straightening in the presence of someone she instinctively recognized as important. "You must be Emma. I'm Victoria." She offered her hand, and Emma shook it with the careful formality of a child trying very hard to make a good impression. Victoria smiled. "Your dad has told me a lot about you. He says you're the one who kept everything together while things were hard." Emma glanced up at Marcus, uncertain how to respond. Victoria continued before the silence could become awkward. "I wanted to meet you because I think it's important to know the people who matter to the people who work here. Your dad is going to be doing important work for this company, and I wanted you to know that we're grateful he's here." She pulled out a chair. "Also, I thought you might like to see what your dad's office looks like, and maybe see some of the systems he's going to be working on." Emma's face lit up. Victoria led them down to the 37th floor and into Marcus's office, where she had arranged for one of the monitors to display a simplified visualization of the building's control systems. Emma stood in front of it, watching the data flow in real time, her expression fascinated. "This is what Dad fixes?" "This is part of it. These systems control everything in the building: power, heating, cooling, security. When something goes wrong, your dad figures out why and makes it work again." Emma turned to look at Marcus. "Like you used to do, before." "Exactly like I used to do." Victoria watched the exchange with an expression Marcus could not quite read. After a few minutes she excused herself, telling Emma she was welcome to visit any time, and left them alone in the office. Emma explored every corner, touching the desk, spinning in the chair, writing her name on the whiteboard with one of the markers. On the train ride home she talked nonstop about the office, the building, the way Victoria had spoken to her like she was someone worth speaking to. Marcus listened, and thought about how children absorb not just what adults say, but how they say it, the respect or dismissal embedded in tone and gesture. Victoria had treated Emma with the same directness she brought to everything else, and Emma had responded to it with a kind of hungry gratitude that made Marcus's chest ache. The work settled into a rhythm over the next 2 weeks. Marcus would arrive at 8, spend the morning deep in documentation and analysis, break for lunch with the engineering team, and spend the afternoon reviewing specific subsystems and drafting recommendations. The issues he identified were addressed quickly, the engineering team responsive to his assessments in a way that suggested they had been waiting for someone who actually understood the architecture to tell them what needed fixing. Derek remained professionally cordial and personally distant. He attended the meetings Marcus called, nodded at the right moments, and never once acknowledged that the improvements being implemented were making his systems more stable and his job easier. Marcus did not particularly care. He had not taken this position to make Derek like him. 3 weeks into the job, Marcus was reviewing the backup power systems when he found something that made him stop. A configuration sequence buried deep in the failover protocols, set up in a way that made no sense given the rest of the architecture. He pulled up the modification history and traced it back to a firmware update 18 months earlier, installed during a routine maintenance window. The update had been signed off by Derek. Marcus sat back in his chair and looked at the code again, making sure he had understood it correctly. The configuration was not just inefficient, it was dangerous. Under certain conditions, the kind of conditions that might occur during a major power disruption, the failover sequence would attempt to draw power from backup systems that were not rated to handle the load. The result would be a cascade failure that could take down the entire building's electrical infrastructure. He picked up his phone and called Victoria. "I need to show you something. Now." She arrived at his office 10 minutes later. Marcus pulled up the configuration on the main monitor and walked her through what he had found. Her expression darkened as she followed the logic. "How bad is this?" "If we lose primary power during a high-load event, this configuration could cause a feedback loop that would damage the backup generators. We'd be looking at a complete power failure that could take days to recover from." Why wasn't this caught during the external audit? Because it only presents under specific conditions, and the audit was done under controlled circumstances. You'd need to simulate a major power disruption during peak load to see the problem, and that's not something you do in a production environment. Victoria was silent for a moment, her jaw tight. "This update was installed 18 months ago. Who signed off on it?" Marcus hesitated. This was the moment where professional courtesy and political navigation would suggest he soften the answer, find a way to present the information that did not directly implicate Derek. But Victoria had not hired him to be politically careful. She had hired him to find problems and tell her the truth about them. "Derek Porter. It's in the approval log." Victoria's expression did not change, but something in her eyes went cold. "Fix it. I'll handle Derek." She left without another word. Marcus spent the next 2 hours implementing the correction, testing it against every scenario he could simulate to make sure the failover would behave correctly under stress. By the time he finished, it was after 7, and the engineering floor was mostly empty. Derek appeared in his doorway just as Marcus was shutting down his workstation. The engineering director's face was flushed, and his voice had an edge Marcus had not heard before. "You went to Victoria about the backup power configuration." "I found a critical vulnerability." "Yes, I went to Victoria." "You could have come to me first. I'm the director of engineering. Protocol is to report issues through the chain of command." Marcus stood up, keeping his voice level. "Protocol is also to not implement configurations that could cause catastrophic failures. The update you signed off on 18 months ago was dangerous. If we had lost power during last month's storm, we could have been down for a week." Derek's expression hardened. That update was reviewed and approved by the external consultant. Dermot Hale reviewed it under standard conditions. He didn't test it under stress because you didn't ask him to. That's not his failure. It's yours. The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Derek stepped into the office and closed the door. "You need to understand something, Marcus. I've been building this engineering division for 5 years. I've hired every person on this team, implemented every protocol we follow, and delivered consistent results quarter after quarter. You've been here 3 weeks. And in 3 weeks I've found 7 critical vulnerabilities that your team missed and prevented a failure that would have cost this company millions. So maybe the question isn't about how long I've been here. Maybe it's about whether the protocols you've been following are actually working. Derek's jaw clenched. Victoria may have given you this position, but I still run this division. If you want to last here, you'll learn to work within the structure instead of trying to tear it down. I'm not trying to tear anything down. I'm trying to make sure the building doesn't fall on our heads. Derek left without responding. Marcus stood alone in his office and felt the weight of what had just happened settle over him. He had made an enemy, and not just any enemy. The person who controlled the engineering division and who had the power to make his work life difficult in 1,000 small ways. But he had also done his job. And if that meant Derek saw him as a threat, then so be it. The confrontation with Derek had consequences that became apparent over the next week. Suddenly, the diagnostic logs Marcus requested took longer to arrive. Engineers who had been eager to collaborate started checking with Derek before agreeing to meetings. Small obstacles appeared in his workflow, nothing overt enough to complain about, but enough to slow him down and make the work harder than it needed to be. Marcus adapted. He worked longer hours, built relationships directly with the engineers he needed, and routed around Derek whenever possible. Victoria noticed because Victoria noticed everything and called him into her office on a Friday afternoon. Derek is making your life difficult. Derek is doing what he needs to do to protect his territory. I expected it. I didn't bring you here to spend your time navigating political games. I brought you here to fix systems. And I'm fixing them. It's just taking longer than it should. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. I'm going to restructure the engineering division, create a separate systems reliability group that reports directly to me. You'll head it. Derek will still run the development side, but operational infrastructure will be yours. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. This was a promotion, a recognition of his value, but it was also a declaration of war. Derek would see it as a direct challenge to his authority, and the engineering division would be caught in the middle. That's going to create conflict. It's going to create clarity. Right now, Derek is responsible for building new systems and maintaining existing ones, and he's better at the first than the second. This splits those responsibilities and puts each under someone who's actually good at it. She stood up and walked to the window. I need you to understand something, Marcus. I didn't hire you because I felt sorry for you, or because I wanted to make a point about second chances. I hired you because you're better at this than anyone else I have access to, and this company needs you to be able to do your job without interference. Marcus thought about Emma, about the apartment in Brooklyn, about the stack of bills that was finally getting smaller. He thought about the fact that taking this promotion would mean painting a target on his back that Derek would spend the next year trying to hit. When do you want to announce it? Monday morning. I'll handle the messaging to the board and the engineering team. You just keep doing what you've been doing. Monday morning arrived with an email from Victoria to the entire engineering division announcing the restructure. Systems reliability would now be a separate group under Marcus's leadership, responsible for all operational infrastructure, security protocols, and crisis response. Development engineering would remain under Derek's leadership, focused on new platform features and client-facing innovations. The engineering floor was quiet when Marcus arrived. People looked up from their workstations as he passed, their expressions ranging from curious to uncertain. Sophie was waiting at his office with a list of engineers who had been reassigned to his new group. 8 people, all of them experienced, several of them people Marcus had already been working with. Derek did not come to congratulate him, did not send an email or stop by to discuss the transition. The silence was deliberate, a message that whatever professional courtesy had existed before was now gone. Marcus spent the morning meeting with his new team, outlining priorities and establishing how they would work together. Robert Chen was enthusiastic. grateful to be focusing on infrastructure instead of chasing feature requests. Jennifer Park admitted she had been hoping for this kind of reorganization for years. By lunchtime, Marcus had a team that was not just competent, but genuinely excited about the work. That afternoon, Victoria called an all-hands meeting for the engineering division. She stood at the front of the largest conference room on the 37th floor and explained the restructure in terms that made it sound like a natural evolution rather than a response to Derek's failures. This company is growing, and our technical infrastructure needs to grow with it. Marcus Reed brings expertise in systems reliability that we haven't had access to before, and this restructure allows us to leverage that expertise where it will have the most impact. Derek sat in the front row, his expression neutral, his body language rigid. When Victoria opened the floor for questions, he was the first to speak. How will this affect project timelines? If systems reliability is now reviewing all operational changes, that adds another approval layer to the development process. It was a reasonable question designed to make the restructure sound like bureaucracy rather than improvement. Victoria handled it smoothly. Systems reliability will be embedded in the development process from the beginning, not added at the end. That means issues get caught earlier, which should actually speed up timelines by reducing the number of problems we discover during implementation. Derek nodded, accepting the answer without acknowledging whether it satisfied him. The rest of the questions were technical, logistical, the kind of details that needed sorting whenever organizational structures changed. By the time the meeting ended, Marcus had a clear mandate and a team that reported directly to him. He also had Derek Porter as a permanent adversary, and the knowledge that every success his team achieved would be seen as evidence of Derek's failures. The restructure changed the rhythm of Marcus's days, but not the core work. He still spent his mornings deep in documentation, his afternoons in meetings with his team, his evenings reviewing the systems that kept Sterling Tech running. The difference was that now he had the authority to implement changes without needing Derek's approval, and the results were immediate. Within a month, his team had addressed 12 critical vulnerabilities and improved system stability to the point where operational incidents dropped by 60%. Victoria highlighted the improvements in her quarterly board presentation, and the institutional investors who had been watching Sterling Tech's performance closely began indicating renewed interest in expanding their commitments. Emma started coming to the office once a week after school, sitting in Marcus's office doing her homework while he worked. Sophie took her under wing, showing her around the building and explaining in simple terms what the different engineering teams did. Emma absorbed it all with the hungry curiosity of a child who had spent years hearing about a world she could not access and was now finally allowed inside. On a Wednesday afternoon in late November, Marcus was reviewing environmental protocols when Emma looked up from her homework. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Are you happy now?" The question was simple, but it hit him sideways, the kind of thing children ask because they notice what adults try to hide. Marcus set down the tablet and turned to face her. "Yeah, sweetheart. I'm happy now." "Good. Because you smile more. Like you used to smile before Mom got sick." Something in his chest cracked open. He had not realized he had been carrying that particular weight, the knowledge that Emma had spent years watching him pretend everything was fine when nothing was fine, that she had learned to read his real feelings in the spaces between what he said and how he looked when he thought no one was paying attention. "Things are better now, for both of us." She nodded and went back to her homework, satisfied with the answer in the way children are satisfied when they have confirmed what they already suspected. December brought the first real snow of the season, and with it a new challenge. One of Sterling Tech's major clients, a commercial real estate firm managing properties across the Northeast, reported intermittent failures in their energy management systems during cold weather events. The failures were unpredictable, sometimes affecting one building and not another, sometimes resolving themselves before maintenance crews could arrive. Victoria assigned the problem to Marcus's team. He spent 3 days reviewing the client's infrastructure remotely before realizing he would need to visit one of the affected buildings in person to understand what was happening. The building was in Boston, a 40-story office tower that used a modified version of the platform Marcus had originally designed. He took the train up on a Thursday morning, arriving at the building just as another cold front was moving through. The facility manager met him in the lobby and took him down to the mechanical rooms where the control systems lived. Marcus spent 2 hours reviewing logs and running diagnostics before he found it. The issue was not in the software, it was in the hardware installation. The environmental sensors had been placed too close to the heating ducts, and during extreme cold events the ducts would radiate enough heat to skew the temperature readings. The system would interpret the skewed data as accurate and adjust the building's heating output accordingly, creating a feedback loop that caused the intermittent failures. The fix was simple, but the discovery process had required someone who understood both the software architecture and the physical principles of how heat moved through a building's mechanical systems. Marcus documented the issue, implemented the correction, and sent a detailed report back to Victoria with recommendations for checking the other buildings in the client's portfolio. On the train back to New York, he thought about how much of engineering was not about writing elegant code or designing sophisticated systems. It was about understanding how things failed in the real world, where physics and human error and unexpected conditions created problems that no simulation could predict. Emma was waiting when he got home, excited to tell him about a project she was doing for school about careers. She had chosen to write about systems engineering, and she wanted Marcus to help her explain what he did in a way her classmates would understand. They sat at the kitchen table, and he walked her through it, translating technical concepts into metaphors a third grader could grasp. Buildings were like bodies, he told her, with systems that had to work together to keep everything healthy. His job was like being a doctor who figured out what was making the building sick and how to make it better. Emma wrote it all down in careful handwriting, her tongue poking out between her teeth in concentration, the way Sarah's used to when she was focused on something important. Marcus watched her work and thought about legacy, about the things we pass down to our children that have nothing to do with money or status. The way we approach problems, the value we place on understanding how things work, the dignity we find in doing a job well even when no one is watching. Christmas came, and Marcus had enough money to buy Emma the art supplies she had been wanting and to pay off the last of the medical bills that had been hanging over him since Sarah died. He wrote the final check on Christmas Eve and dropped it in the mailbox on the corner, and when he walked back to the apartment through the snow, he felt lighter than he had in years. Victoria gave the engineering division bonuses based on the improvements in system stability, and Marcus's share was more than he had made in 6 months of cleaning floors. He opened a college savings account for Emma and put half of it away, saving the rest for the inevitable expenses that came with raising a child in a city where everything cost more than you budgeted for. New Year's came, and with it a moment of reflection. Marcus stood at his office window on the 37th floor watching the city prepare for the evening's celebrations, and he thought about the fact that a year ago he had been invisible to almost everyone in this building. A man in a gray uniform pushing a cart, present but not seen, necessary but not valued. Now he had a team that respected him, a CEO who trusted him, and work that mattered. He had proven to himself and to the world that talent does not disappear just because circumstances force you to set it aside. It waits, patient and persistent, for the moment when you get a chance to use it again. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. "Team dinner tomorrow night to celebrate the year. Bring Emma. We're going somewhere nice." Marcus smiled and texted back confirmation. He locked his office and took the elevator down to the lobby, where Sophie was waiting to walk out with him. They talked about the projects lined up for the new year, the systems that still needed attention, the improvements they could make if they had the resources and the time. Outside the building, the city was loud with pre-celebration energy, people streaming toward Times Square and the bars in Midtown, everyone trying to mark the transition from one year to the next with noise and company, and the illusion that midnight meant something would fundamentally change. Marcus walked to the subway through crowds that barely noticed him, just another person in a city of 8 million people all trying to get somewhere. But he noticed them. Noticed the janitor emptying trash bins outside a coffee shop, moving with the efficient invisibility of someone who had learned to work around people without being seen. Noticed the security guard standing outside a bank, present but not acknowledged by the people walking past. He thought about stopping, about saying something to acknowledge them, but he kept walking. Because the truth about invisibility is that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is not make someone visible when they have learned to find dignity in going unnoticed. The train was crowded, and Marcus stood holding the pole, watching the stations flash by in the darkness outside the window. Emma would be home by now, probably already in her pajamas, even though it was barely 6 o'clock, reading one of the books he had bought her for Christmas. When he got home, she was exactly where he expected her to be, curled up on the couch with a book about the solar system. She looked up when he came in. "Victoria invited you to dinner tomorrow night, somewhere nice." Emma's eyes went wide. "Can I wear my fancy dress?" "You can wear whatever you want." She grinned and went back to her book. Marcus made dinner, and they ate together at the kitchen table, talking about her school project and his day, and whether the snow would stick around through the weekend. Normal conversation, the kind families have when life is not a crisis, when the weight of survival has lifted enough to make room for smaller pleasures. After Emma went to bed, Marcus sat alone in the living room and thought about the year that had just passed, the night of the storm, the moment he had walked through that door, the choice he had made to risk everything on the chance that someone would listen. He thought about Victoria standing in front of 41 people and saying his name out loud, acknowledging what he had done in a way that could not be taken back or minimized. He thought about David Morrison standing up in that room and offering the apology that Morrison Blake had never given him, the public recognition that the failure had not been his fault. And he thought about Emma, 8 years old and wise beyond her years, who had known all along what he was worth even when the world had stopped seeing it. There are people in this world who carry more than the world will ever credit them for, who have been pressed down by grief and circumstance and the slow accumulation of hard years until they live smaller than their actual dimensions, whose talent and knowledge and dignity remain intact beneath everything that has been piled on top of them, waiting not for rescue, not for luck, but for the single moment when the right door opens and they are still standing close enough to walk through it. Marcus Reed had been that kind of person for a long time, and when the door finally opened, he had not hesitated, had not waited for permission or validation, had simply done what he had always known how to do, and the world, finally, had adjusted itself to the fact of him. Outside the window, the city continued its endless motion, 8 million people living their lives in the spaces between visibility and invisibility, success and struggle, the person they are and the person they might become. The new year would arrive at midnight, whether anyone was watching or not. Time would keep moving forward the way it always did. But in a small apartment in Brooklyn, in a kitchen that had held a father and daughter through the longest and hardest years, something that had been broken was finally whole again. And that was enough.